You ever catch yourself playing detective in your own life, trying to figure out why you did that weird thing or, why that other person reacted the way they did?
Oh, definitely. It's like we're constantly trying to piece together the why
Hmm.
behind things.
Yeah, like searching for explanations.
Right. That drive to understand the why
Yeah.
is so fundamental, especially when things don't go as planned or like when the stakes are high. We really want to know what caused the outcome.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We've got this fascinating piece from the Educational Psychology Review from back in 2000 by Bernard Wiener. He was a real, thought leader in this area.
Oh, yeah.
And he laid out these two interconnected ways we think about what motivates us. And it all kind of boils down to this idea of attribution theory.
Yeah. Attribution theory, basically,
Mm
how we explain the causes of events.
hmm.
And our goal today is to unpack these two perspectives for you, the listener, to give you a much clearer understanding of how we make these causal explanations, particularly when we're looking at successes and failures.
Yeah, getting a handle on this can give you a completely new lens, right? For understanding not just your own behavior, but also like everyone around you.
Absolutely. So Wiener breaks motivation down into two main but related areas. First, there's intrapersonal motivation.
Intrapersonal. Okay.
Think of this as your internal world,
Right.
your own thoughts, your expectations about what might happen next, and those really personal feelings like pride, guilt, shame.
Got it. The stuff going on inside your head.
Exactly. And the core idea here is that on this internal level, we're all a bit like scientists.
Scientists. How
Well,
so?
we're constantly observing what happens, trying to figure out the underlying causes, and then, making decisions and taking actions based on those understandings. We're trying to predict and control our world.
Okay, okay. The internal scientist. I like that. What's the second part?
Then we have the second piece, interpersonal motivation. Here, the focus shifts outward.
Outward. To other people.
Right. To how we think about other people's role in events and the emotions we feel toward them. As a result, things like getting frustrated with someone or feeling sympathy for them.
Ah, okay. So how we react to others.
Precisely. And the way Wiener frames this is quite different. In this interpersonal space, he suggests we operate more like judges.
Judges. Like in a courtroom?
Kind of. Evaluating situations and, importantly, assigning responsibility to others.
Interesting metaphors. Scientist and judge. Okay, let's dig into this person as scientist idea first, this intrapersonal side of motivation. Say something happens to you, you get a disappointing grade on a test. What's going on in your head according to this theory?
Well, the first thing that usually hits us is an immediate emotional reaction, like an outcome-dependent feeling.
Gut reaction.
Exactly. If things go well, we're happy. If they don't, we're likely feeling disappointed or frustrated. These are pretty instantaneous responses.
Totally. Nobody does a celebratory dance after failing a test. So after that initial gut feeling, what's the next step for our inner scientist?
Then comes the big why question. You start trying to pinpoint what caused that outcome. Why did I do poorly?
The investigation begins.
Right. And Wiener points out that we're much more likely to really analyze this when the result is negative, unexpected, or when it's something we really care about.
Makes sense. If it's a surprise or it matters, you want to know why.
Exactly. If you expect to ace a quiz, and you do, you probably won't spend much time dissecting why. But if you completely bomb it, you'll definitely be on a quest for answers.
Right, those surprises or those failures, they tend to stick with us more, don't they? So where did these why answers come from? What influences the causes we end up believing?
A lot of factors, actually. Your past experiences play a role, what you consider to be normal or typical in a similar situation, social norms. And even some of our own built-in biases can play a significant role. For instance, there's what's called the hedonic bias.
Hedonic bias.
Yeah, it's this tendency we have to take personal credit when things go our way, like I'm smart, but point the finger at external factors when they don't. The test was unfair.
The ego protection mechanism.
Pretty much. And it's fascinating how our current feelings can actually shape the causes we end up believing were at play.
So if I'm already feeling a bit insecure, I might be more inclined to attribute a setback to something internal, like thinking I'm just not good enough.
Exactly. Your mood can color the attribution you make. And once you've settled on a cause, maybe you decide you didn't study effectively or the test was unusually difficult or, you just had a bad day. That cause has these three key dimensions that Wiener emphasizes.
3 dimensions. Okay, what are they?
Locus, stability, and controllability.
Locus, stability, controllability. Okay, let's break those down for a second. Locus is about where you see the cause originating, right? Internal or external?
Precisely. Is the cause something internal within you, like the effort you put in or your natural abilities? Or is it external, outside of you, like how challenging the task was, or whether you got help from someone else?
Okay, internal, external. Got it. And stability. That's about whether you view the cause as something permanent, like likely to stick around, or something that could change. Temporary.
That's the key. Is it something relatively constant, stable, like your general aptitude for, say, math? Or is it something more temporary, unstable, like your mood on a specific day, or just plain bad luck?
Stable versus unstable.
Hmm.
Okay, and finally, controllability. This is about whether you believe you have any power to influence or change that cause. Like, can you do something about it?
Exactly. Can you actively, willfully alter it? Putting in more effort is a prime example of a controllable cause. You choose how much effort to exert.
Right.
On the other hand, something like random chance, or maybe your innate talents, or even how difficult the teacher made the test, those are generally seen as things you can't willfully change. Uncontrollable.
Okay, so we've got these three aspects, these dimensions of the cause we identify. Locus, stability, controllability. Now, how do these actually impact what drives us, our motivation? This is the core of it, yeah.
This is where it gets really interesting. Stability primarily shapes our expectations for the future, our expectancy of success.
How so?
If you attribute a failure to a cause you see as stable, like I'm just bad at this, you're more likely to anticipate the same outcome happening again. You'll probably expect to struggle with it in the future.
Right, because the cause isn't going away.
Exactly. But if you attribute that same failure to something unstable, like I didn't prepare well this time because I had the flu, well, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll fail next time. The cause was temporary. Your expectation for future success might remain high, or at least unchanged.
That makes total sense. If I think the reason I stumbled is going to be a persistent issue, I'm not going to be too optimistic about what's ahead. Okay, so stability affects expectation. What about locus and controllability? How do those factors play into motivation?
They have a significant impact on our feelings, the effect associated with the outcome, and how we value success and failure.
Feelings. Okay.
Locus, specifically attributing success to internal causes, leads to feelings of pride and can really boost our self-esteem.
Pride.
Think about it. You might feel generally pleased, happy if you achieve something, maybe win the lottery, but you'll feel a real sense of pride if you believe it was a direct result of your own hard work or abilities.
Right. Happiness is just, yay, good outcome, but pride is, yay, I did that.
Exactly. Wiener used this great analogy. Everyone sitting down to a delicious meal can enjoy it, feel happy, but only the person who cooked it feels the true pride of creation.
I love that analogy. It makes the distinction really clear. So internal success equals pride. What about when things don't go so well? Failure.
That's where controllability comes in, along with locus, the internal-external dimension. If you experience a setback, a failure, and you attribute it to something internal ADD controllable like not preparing adequately, not putting in enough effort.
Something you could have changed.
Right. The feeling you're most likely to experience is guilt. You feel like you could have, maybe should have, made different choices. Guilt can actually be motivating, pushing you to change your behavior next time.
Okay, guilt for internal controllable failures. What if it's internal but uncontrollable?
Now that's different. If you attribute failure to something internal but uncontrollable, like believing you simply lack the inherent ability, you're just not smart enough. That often leads to feelings of shame, embarrassment, and even humiliation.
Oh, wow. That distinction between guilt and shame is so insightful. Guilt feels like I made a mistake, whereas shame feels more like there's something fundamentally wrong with me.
Precisely. Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about the self. And shame is often much more debilitating, leading to withdrawal or defensiveness rather than constructive change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So these expectations about the future driven by stability and these specific emotions like pride, guilt, and shame driven by locus and controllability.
Exactly. These expectations and emotions, in turn, are powerful drivers of our subsequent behavior. Our thoughts and feelings really set the stage for what we do next. It's not just thinking, it's not just feeling, it's both, together.
You mentioned earlier how this applies in social situations, like dating. Can you walk us through that example again with these dimensions?
Sure. Imagine someone, let's call him Bill, gets turned down for a date by Mary. If Bill attributes that rejection to something internal, it's me, stable, it's always going to be me, I'm just not likable, and uncontrollable. There's nothing I can do about being unattractive or awkward.
That sounds like a really negative spiral.
It is. That combination is likely to take a real toll on his self-esteem, internal cause. Because he sees the cause as stable, he'll likely anticipate future rejections, and the perceived uncontrollability can breed feelings of shame or hopelessness.
So what's the likely behavioral outcome?
The likely outcome is that he might withdraw. He might stop asking people out, stop putting himself out there romantically to avoid experiencing that anticipated pain and shame again.
Wow. That paints a really vivid picture of how these internal attributions, this scientist process, can dramatically shape our social behavior and well-being.
Absolutely.
Now, you also touched on how this connects to achievement in more formal settings, like school, and even serious issues like students dropping out. Can you elaborate on that Van Laar research you mentioned?
Yes, absolutely. This was really illuminating research looking at the reasons behind historically higher dropout rates among African-American college students compared to their white peers. Van Laar explored two competing explanations through this attribution theory lens.
Okay, what were the two hypotheses?
One was what she called the internal attribution hypothesis. This proposed that perhaps these students were attributing academic struggles, lower grades, maybe to a perceived lack of inherent ability. That's internal, potentially seen as stable and uncontrollable.
Right, the I'm not smart enough explanation.
Exactly. And according to the theory, that kind of attribution would likely lead to lower self-esteem, lower expectations for future academic success, and ultimately could contribute to them dropping out.
That seems like a straightforward, if pretty disheartening explanation on the surface. What was the alternative?
The alternative was the external attribution hypothesis. This suggested that these students might attribute their difficulties not to themselves, but to external barriers within the system, things like experiencing racism, discrimination, or maybe just feeling alienated in the university environment. These are external causes.
So blaming the system, not themselves.
Right. And in this case, even when facing setbacks, their self-esteem might remain relatively higher because they aren't blaming their own fundamental capabilities, the causes outside them.
Okay, so self-esteem stays intact. But what about expectations?
Well, they might still have lower expectations for future success, not because they doubt themselves, but because they perceive these external barriers as persistent, maybe stable. So this could also lead to dropping out feeling like the system is stacked against them. But interestingly, this external attribution could also fuel different emotions, like anger directed at the system, and potentially even motivate social activism instead of just withdrawal.
Fascinating. Two very different paths, stemming from different attributions for the same outcome. And what did Van Laar's research actually uncover? Which hypothesis held more water?
Her findings largely supported the external attribution explanation.
Really?
Yes, this aligned much better with a separate, consistent observation that Black college students often maintain self-esteem levels comparable to their white peers, even when there are disparities in average GPAs.
Huh. So the data didn't really fit the idea that they were internalizing failure and feeling bad about themselves?
Exactly. It challenged that potentially simplistic, maybe even blaming narrative. Instead, it suggested that perceiving and attributing difficulties to external factors, like discrimination, played a significant role. It really underscores how the attributional framework gives us a much richer, more nuanced understanding. It's not just about success or failure, it's about why you think it happened and how that why connects expectancy, self-esteem, and emotions, all leading to complex outcomes like dropping out or activism.
It really adds so many layers, much more complex than just saying they weren't doing well. Okay, so that's the person as scientist, our internal investigator trying to make sense of things, influencing our feelings and future actions. Now, let's switch gears and talk about the person as judge, this interpersonal side of motivation. Remind us of the main idea here.
Okay, so here the focus shifts entirely to how other people react to our successes and failures. Think about teachers evaluating students, parents responding to a child's report card, friends reacting to your news, the social environment.
Right, how the audience sees the performance.
Exactly. And the reactions, the judgments they make, the emotions they feel, the actions they take are also heavily influenced by the attributions they make about our performance or situation.
So, going back to the student who didn't do well on an exam, let's look at it from the teacher's perspective now. What's likely going on in the teacher's mind, according to this interpersonal theory?
Well, similar to the student, the teacher will probably try to figure out the cause. Why did the student fail? Was it lack of effort, lack of ability, bad luck, a difficult test?
They're doing their own attributional analysis.
Correct. But the crucial element here, especially when it comes to predicting the teacher's reaction, is how controllable they perceive the cause to be.
Controllability again, but from the observer's view.
Yes, if the teacher attributes the poor performance to something the student could have controlled, the classic example being a perceived lack of effort in studying.
They just didn't try hard enough.
Right. If that's the teacher's attribution, they are much more likely to hold the student responsible for the negative outcome. Responsibility, in this context, really stems from the belief that the outcome could have been otherwise if the student had just made different choices, if they had exerted the necessary effort.
Ah, okay. So if the teacher believes the student was simply lazy or didn't prepare, they see the student as accountable for the bad grade. And what kind of emotion does that judgment of responsibility typically trigger in the observer, in the teacher?
Anger, or perhaps frustration, irritation. When someone is perceived as responsible for a negative outcome due to a cause they could have controlled, the typical emotional response from others is some form of anger.
Like if your roommate doesn't do their share of the cleaning because they were just lounging around.
Exactly. You feel annoyed, maybe angry because you perceive the cause, their lack of action, as controllable, and therefore you hold them responsible.
Okay. And anger, in turn, usually leads to what kind of actions or responses from the teacher, the judge?
Often to more negative or what Wiener termed antisocial responses, things like punishment, reprimands, negative feedback, maybe assigning blame.
So the teacher might give the student a stern talking to, maybe express disappointment, perhaps be less inclined to offer help or support.
Precisely. The anger motivates actions aimed at correction or expressing disapproval.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
Now let's flip the scenario. What happens if the teacher attributes the student's failure to something the student couldn't control? Like they genuinely believe the student struggles due to a lack of aptitude for the subject or maybe a diagnosed learning disability.
In that scenario, where the cause is perceived as uncontrollable, the student isn't typically held responsible. The perception is that they didn't have the free will or the capacity to change the outcome in that instance. They couldn't reasonably have been expected to perform better given the attributed cause.
So no blame attached.
Right. And instead of anger, the emotion that's more likely to be elicited in the observer, the teacher, is sympathy, or perhaps pity or concern.
Sympathy. Feeling sorry for them rather than angry at them.
Exactly. We tend to feel sympathy for someone if we believe they are struggling due to factors beyond their control. Think about reactions to people with physical disabilities or those facing unavoidable hardships.
Right. And sympathy usually leads to more positive, supportive responses, doesn't it?
Yes, generally. Sympathy typically motivates pro-social behaviors, offering help, providing additional resources, showing understanding, encouragement, and support.
So in this case, the teacher might offer the student extra tutoring, suggest alternative learning strategies, maybe adjust expectations slightly, or simply be more patient and understanding of their difficulties.
Exactly. The feeling of sympathy drives actions aimed at helping or alleviating the person's struggle.
So it seems like this interpersonal side of motivation, the judge perspective, really hinges on this crucial judgment about perceived responsibility, which is directly linked to whether the cause of an event is seen as controllable by the person who experienced it.
That's the absolute key.
And it sounds like in this interpersonal judgment context, where the cause originates, locus internal, external, and whether it's stable or not, stability become less critical compared to controllability, right?
That's a really important distinction Wiener makes. While locus and stability are central for our own internal motivational processes, our pride, shame, expectations, when we shift to the role of observing and judging others' actions and outcomes, controllability and the resulting inference of responsibility become the pivotal factors. They're the main drivers shaping our emotional reactions, anger versus sympathy, and how we choose to respond, punishment versus help.
Interesting. So the dimensions matter differently depending on whether you're the scientist analyzing yourself or the judge evaluating someone else.
Precisely. And Wiener argues that this sequence event leads to attribution. Attribution of controllability leads to judgment of responsibility. Responsibility influences emotion, anger, sympathy, and emotion drives action, punishment, help. This whole thinking, feeling, acting chain with responsibility at its core extends far beyond just academic achievement.
How so? Can you give us some other examples of how this person as judge framework plays out in different social contexts?
Oh, absolutely. Consider how we react to individuals who are stigmatized in some way. Take homelessness, for example.
Okay.
If someone experiencing homelessness is perceived as being in that situation due to controllable causes, maybe perceived laziness or unwillingness to work, observers might feel anger or resentment and react negatively, perhaps avoiding them or opposing social support programs.
Judging them as responsible for their situation.
Right. But if the homelessness is understood to be due to uncontrollable factors, perhaps a severe mental illness, a sudden job loss due to economic downturn, fleeing domestic violence, then observers are much more likely to feel sympathy and be motivated to offer support or advocate for assistance programs. The perceived controllability of the cause of this stigma is crucial.
That makes a huge difference in the reaction.
Huge difference. Or think about help giving more generally. If someone asks you for help, say needing notes because they skipped class, controllable cause, seen as irresponsible, you might feel annoyed and be less willing to help.
Yeah, get your own notes.
Exactly. But if they need notes because they were genuinely sick and couldn't attend class, uncontrollable cause, not their fault, you're much more likely to feel sympathy and readily share your notes.
Same request for help, a totally different reaction based on the perceived cause.
Totally different. Even in situations involving harm or aggression. If someone bumps into you and spills your coffee, your reaction will depend heavily on whether you perceive it as intentional, controllable, versus accidental, uncontrollable. Intentional harm evokes anger and maybe a desire for retribution, while accidental harm might elicit annoyance, but also perhaps sympathy if they seem genuinely clumsy or upset about it.
So in all these varied interpersonal situations, we're constantly, perhaps unconsciously, acting like these judges. We're evaluating whether someone is responsible for a given situation or outcome based on perceived controllability, and then dispensing either negative consequences fueled by anger or supportive actions fueled by sympathy based on that judgment and our resulting emotions.
That's the essence of the person is judge metaphor. We are making these rapid, often implicit moral evaluations about responsibility, about right and wrong in a sense, and then assigning consequences based on those perceptions.
And you mentioned Wiener's early research really showed this quite clearly. Tell us about that 1970 study with Kukla.
Right, that was a classic study, really foundational. They presented subjects with scenarios describing hypothetical students who varied on three factors: their innate ability, high or low, the effort they exerted, high or low, and their exam performance, success or failure. The subjects then had to evaluate these students, essentially deciding how much reward or punishment they deserved.
Okay, so manipulating ability, effort, and outcome. What was the key finding?
The really striking finding was about who got the most positive evaluation. It wasn't necessarily the most successful student overall. Instead, the hypothetical student described as having low ability but exerting high effort received the most praise and the least amount of punishment, regardless of whether they ultimately succeeded or failed.
Wow, really? The low ability, high effort student was rewarded the most. Why do you think that is?
It really seems to tap into deeply ingrained cultural values, particularly in Western societies, perhaps reflecting something like the Protestant work ethic. We tend to really admire and reward sheer hard work and perseverance, especially when it involves overcoming a perceived disadvantage or handicap. Trying hard, even if you lack natural talent, is seen as morally virtuous.
So effort is highly valued by the judge.
Highly valued. Conversely, they also found that the hypothetical students who were described as having high ability but who didn't try hard and ended up failing were punished particularly severely.
Oh, the underachiever.
Exactly. It's almost as if observers felt they were squandering their potential, violating an expectation, which elicited a strong negative reaction, more anger and blame.
That totally resonates. We often get more frustrated with talented people who don't apply themselves than with less talented people who struggle despite trying.
Precisely. And as you noted, later work by researchers like Juvonen, which was discussed elsewhere in that journal issue, showed that these kinds of social judgments can even vary depending on who is doing the judging. Peers might react differently than teachers, for instance. The social context matters.
That makes perfect sense. Different roles, different expectations. You also mentioned another study, Farwell and Wiener from 1996, that looked specifically at the perceived fairness of teacher evaluations. What did that research reveal about this judge perspective?
Right. That study dove into what people consider fair punishment or evaluation in an academic setting. They presented scenarios where students failed an exam, and the reason was explicitly stated as either a lack of ability, uncontrollable, or a lack of effort, controllable. Then they showed different negative evaluations the teacher might give, varying levels of severity. Subjects had to judge how fair each teacher evaluation seemed.
Okay, so judging the judge, in a way, what did they find was considered fair?
What they found was that the evaluations were generally perceived as most fair when there was a clear disparity in the negative feedback given. Specifically, evaluations were seen as fair when the student who failed due to lack of effort received a more severe negative evaluation compared to the student who failed due to a perceived lack of ability.
So people felt it was fair to be tougher on the student who seemingly could have done better but chose not to, compared to the student who appeared limited by their capabilities.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It strongly supports the idea that evaluation, especially in achievement contexts, isn't just about the outcome. It's fundamentally viewed as a moral judgment. And that moral judgment is heavily mediated by these perceptions of responsibility, which hinge on controllability. Fairness, in this view, requires differentiating based on perceived responsibility.
Treating people differently based on why they failed is seen as fair.
Yes, according to the participants in that study.
And this ties into even deeper questions about the purpose of punishment itself, right? You mentioned the 1997 research by Wiener and colleagues on the function of punishment in the classroom. What did that uncover?
Yes, they explored the underlying goals teachers might have when they administer punishment. Broadly, punishment can serve two main functions. There's the utilitarian goal, aiming to change future behavior, to deter the student or others from repeating the mistake. And then there's the retributive goal, focused on delivering justice for the past wrongdoing, giving the student what they deserve based on their actions.
Okay, future change versus past justice.
Right. They gave teachers scenarios where a student failed due to different attributed causes. Stable controllable, like chronic laziness. Unstable controllable, didn't try hard this time. Stable uncontrollable, consistent lack of aptitude. And unstable uncontrollable, temporary lack of specific knowledge. Teachers rated how much they would punish and why.
And what was the main finding about teachers' motivations?
Well, they found that teachers certainly consider the utilitarian goal. They do want to encourage better behavior in the future. However, the research indicated that the drive for punishment was often more strongly tilted towards retribution, that sense of delivering just deserts, particularly when the cause of the failure was seen as both stable and controllable.
So the chronically lazy student, the one perceived as consistently choosing not to try despite being able to.
That student was most likely to elicit a retributive response from the teachers. The punishment felt more like it was about balancing the scales for past, ongoing irresponsibility, rather than just trying to fix future behavior.
Wow. And you mentioned they found similar patterns in how people think about punishment for much more serious offenses.
Yes, interestingly, they found very similar patterns when presenting scenarios involving crimes like burglary and murder. When the cause of the crime was perceived as controllable by the perpetrator, especially for severe outcomes, there was a much stronger endorsement of retributive justifications for punishment. They deserve to be punished over purely utilitarian ones like rehabilitation or deterrence.
That's a pretty profound connection to consider, that our immediate gut reactions to a student not studying for a test might actually be rooted in some of the same fundamental psychological principles that shape our society's views on criminal justice.
It really does raise a significant, maybe even provocative question, doesn't it? Are these seemingly vastly different domains of our lives, the classroom and the courtroom, actually governed by similar underlying psychological mechanisms related to how we attribute cause, infer controllability, and assign responsibility? It's definitely a thought-provoking implication of this line of research.
It really is. Okay, so we've explored these two fascinating perspectives separately: the interpersonal scientist analyzing the self and the interpersonal judge evaluating others. But as you mentioned right at the beginning, they're not entirely independent silos. How do these two systems actually interact and influence each other in real life?
That's a crucial point. They absolutely have a reciprocal influence. They're constantly interacting in a dynamic way. Let's take an example.
Okay.
Suppose a student experiences failure and, through their scientist process, attributes it to a perceived lack of inherent aptitude, an internal, stable, uncontrollable cause. They start thinking, I'm just not good at this.
Leading to low expectancy and maybe shame.
Right. Now consider the observers, the teacher, maybe parents. If they also attribute the student's failure to low ability, uncontrollable cause, their judge reaction is likely to be sympathy. They might offer extra help, lower expectations, say things like, don't worry, this subject is just hard for you.
Okay, they're trying to be supportive based on their attribution.
Exactly. But those very sympathetic responses, while well-intentioned, can inadvertently reinforce the student's own internal attribution. The student hears the sympathy, sees the lowered expectations, and thinks, see, even they know I can't do it. This external feedback loop can unfortunately deepen the student's feelings of shame and helplessness, potentially leading to further withdrawal.
Wow, so the judge's sympathy can actually confirm the scientist's negative conclusion?
It can, yes. Now let's consider the opposite scenario. Student fails, but this time the student initially isn't sure why or maybe blames the test. But the teacher, judge, attributes the failure to a lack of effort, a controllable cause.
So the teacher feels.
Anger or disappointment. And they might express that. You could have done better if you had studied. I expect more effort from you. That external reaction, the anger and the explicit linking of the outcome to controllable effort, acts as powerful social feedback to the student.
Right, it sends a clear message about responsibility.
Exactly. If the student internalizes that message, they might then shift their own attribution scientist towards lack of effort. Maybe the teacher's right. I didn't really try hard enough. And attributing failure to lack of effort, internal, controllable, typically leads to feelings of
Guilt.
guilt. And guilt, unlike shame, can be adaptive.
Mhm.
It can motivate the student to actually change their behavior, study harder next time to avoid feeling guilty again, and to meet the teacher's expectations.
So the judge's anger can potentially lead the scientist to a more motivating attribution and emotion.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
It shows how the way others react to us, based on their attributions, can powerfully shape our own internal attributions and our resulting emotional responses and subsequent actions. And of course, our own attributions and the behaviors they lead to will then influence how others perceive and react to us in the future.
It really is a continuous feedback loop, isn't it? Between our internal world, the scientists figuring things out, and our social environment reacting to us, the judge, making evaluations.
Precisely. The interpersonal and interpersonal motivational systems described by Wiener are deeply interconnected and constantly influencing the thoughts, feelings, and actions of everyone involved in any given social or achievement situation. They aren't separate theories. They're two sides of the same motivational coin.
Wow, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into attribution theory. Really powerful stuff. So for you, the listener, wrapping things up, what are the key things to take away from our discussion today?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that understanding these two interconnected perspectives, the scientist within and the judge without, offers you a really valuable framework, a new lens for making sense of motivation in yourself and others.
How so, specifically?
On the interpersonal scientist level, it helps you become more aware of how the explanations you create for your own successes and failures directly impact your expectations for the future and the specific emotions you experience: pride, guilt, shame. Recognizing your attributional patterns can be the first step towards changing them if they aren't serving you well.
Becoming a better scientist of yourself.
Exactly. And then on the interpersonal judge level, it provides this lens through which to understand how your actions, your successes, your failures, even your circumstances, are likely to be perceived and judged by other people. It helps explain why they might react with anger or sympathy, why they might offer help or impose consequences.
Understanding the courtroom you're operating in, so to speak.
Yeah, understanding the logic of the judge and realizing that their judgment often hinges crucially on their perception of whether the cause of your situation was controllable by you.
And it's clear that these ideas aren't just confined to the classroom or the workplace, are they? These principles seem to have much broader relevance to our lives.
Oh, absolutely. The reach is vast. From gaining a deeper understanding of your own drive and resilience when you're pursuing personal goals, to navigating complex social interactions and relationship conflicts, to even grappling with bigger societal issues like reactions to poverty, addiction, or criminal justice reform. This attributional perspective offers powerful insights across a huge spectrum of human experience.
It really provides a unifying way to think about motivation in so many different areas.
It does. It highlights these fundamental psychological processes related to explaining causes and assigning responsibility.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to really chew on after this deep dive. How might consciously examining your own attributions, really asking yourself, why do I believe this happened? And analyzing those causes in terms of locus, stability, and controllability, how might that change the way you approach challenges in your life?
And relatedly, how might consciously considering the attributions that others might be making about you, particularly regarding controllability and responsibility, change how you navigate your relationships and present yourself in social situations?
Could understanding these dual perspectives, recognizing when you're acting like the internal scientist and when others, or you, are acting like the external judge, could that lead to greater self-awareness, maybe more empathy, and ultimately more effective and maybe even more fulfilling interactions?
It's definitely something worth pondering, isn't it? How becoming more aware of these deep attributional processes could fundamentally shift how we experience and interact with the world around us.